Chris Ferguson is an American psychologist who serves as a professor and co-chair of psychology at Stetson University in Florida. He previously served as an associate professor of psychology and criminal justice at Texas A&M International University. Ferguson holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Central Florida. He has clinical experience with juvenile justice populations, as well as conducting evaluations for Child Protective Services. In 2013, he was awarded a Distinguished Early Career Profession Award, and in 2014, he was named a Fellow of the American Psychological Association. In addition to his academic work, he has published a historical mystery novel entitled Suicide Kings, and more importantly, he plays in a Pink Floyd cover band called Gods of Avalon. I invited the professor on the show to discuss a recent piece he authored called Stuck in the Middle. Academia is a mess, but there is still hope. In it, he talks about topics like suppressed speech, sacred dogma and its effect on education, online mobs, the attack of academic freedom, and what it's like to be a university professor today. I hope you learned as much as I did from Chris. Well, that's our legal warning, sir. Thank you very much for coming on True 30 this morning. It's good to have you, Chris.
It's awesome to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, no problem. As I sought you out as a guest after I read your article, Stuck in the Middle, and then you had parenthetically of academia, and you're mutual friends with my friend Carrie Mendoza. So I actually emailed her and I said, I really want to talk with this professor. I'm assuming this article wasn't easy to write or there was some significant blowback. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the article and why you wrote it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, what I've been experiencing, I've been in academia for about 25 years now, and I think my experience with it is, I would guess, something other people have experienced as well. I mean, so if we look at like conservative complaints about academia, these are nothing new. I mean, I think probably most of the time I've been in academia, there's been some howling about liberal indoctrination or whatever wording is used.
Yeah.
And, I think thinking back like 10, 12, 15 years ago, I mean, there was always an element of truth to it in the sense that most of us were liberals, myself included. It was hard to find a lot of conservatives in of authority and on a college campus. But most of us were just, sure, there's a certain element of we bring our politics with us a little bit, but most of it just wanted to teach psychology or chemistry or biology or whatever the hell, engineering, whatever we happen to be teaching. We weren't really worried too much about, I might make an occasional joke about George W. Bush or whatever, but for the most part, it wasn't, go vote who you want. I don't really care.
Right.
So I think a lot of like 10 or 12 years ago, a lot of those complaints, and I worked in Texas at the time, about 10, 12 years ago. So there were a lot of divides between academia and a mostly Republican state legislature. And so a lot of them felt like, I mean, I get it. We probably could use some more conservatives, but on the other hand, we're really not trying to churn out like Maoists, or this sort of stuff. It felt like it really was, the criticism was overblown. There was a fair element to it, but it was mostly like, defunding universities is not the way to go. And I still don't believe defunding universities is the correct way to go. But now, like 10, 12 years later, it feels like there was this like ridiculous criticism, and universities just kind of rose to resemble that ridiculous criticism the last decade or so. And so now it's kind of like, oh my God, the conservatives are kind of have a point now. I mean, the sort of, and I still think that it's not most professors, it's not most students, but it is the group of folks that most of us just thought were kind of cute. Like, a decade ago, it's fair. Kids should have exposure to really crazy ideas, right? It's part of critical thinking, and I still believe that. I'm doing a lot of throat clearing already, but that group, that cohort, which is maybe 10% at most of the university, are now incredibly powerful, and they're vetted by administrators who mostly just want to check boxes to advance their own careers. So they don't want to fight over whether DEI is a good idea or not, or whether, I don't know, saying that anybody who comes to campus who has a heterodox idea needs to be shouted down or deplatformed or whatever. Yeah. So all these problems with like free speech on campus, the coercion, the groupthink, are now, I think, for many of us, are certainly difficult to ignore. I mean, we really do have a problem with a lot of the stuff on college campuses now that maybe we didn't have a decade ago. And it's time to admit that, it's time to acknowledge that we probably do really need to look at what we're doing at the university level, what we're doing to our students, what we're doing with our students, and charging them, ridiculous amounts of money to do to them, which is another concern, and figure out how we can maybe walk things back at least a decade or two to where things were, and maybe reform in some other ways, commit more to free speech than we have, commit more to, sort of, institutional neutrality than we have, and so on and so forth. Lest, we have the DeSantis approach, I think that certainly in the state of Florida, DeSantis is very popular.
Yes.
And I think he's very popular for exactly the sorts of things he's doing to public schools in both K-12 and universities in Florida. I mean, his approach is popular with Democrats in Florida, not just Republicans in Florida. Right. It's across the board. People they're taking tenure away from university professors, and the percentage of people that care, it's probably single-digit percentage of people. The coal miners and like orange, agricultural workers, are not like weeping in their beds over the lack of tenure of college professors. So I think at university level, we've done a really bad job of communicating to the public exactly what the value of what we do is. And if anything, we've done the opposite. We really the colleges look insane.
Yeah. And that's actually why I thought the article was so poignant. Just a quote from your own article. You mentioned your 25 years on the job and how much you love it. You have from the right, politicians are attempting to diminish academic freedom, suppress speech, and weaken tenure. From the left, implausible theories are enforced like sacred dogma by zealous activists, feckless administrators, and online mobs, creating a different but equally dangerous attack on academic freedom. Part of this, what you mentioned in the following paragraph, says various popular but empirically dubious theories in the humanities and social sciences set the stage for this. Most prominent among these theories are critical race theory and the new postmodern gender ideology. But other widely practiced post-theories, such as post-colonialism, which were crucial as well as lived experiences, was often promoted over reason and data. And jargon such as privilege and Latinx and patriarchy and intersectionality all achieved a kind of quasi-religious status. And so I thought that was the opening too, but that was in the first page. And I was like, all right, this guy's not pulling punches. And I loved it for that reason. And you mentioned heterodox, which, immediately reminds me of Dr. Jonathan Haidt. So he's one of your brethren at NYU. And he wrote a book with Greg Lakonioff called The Coddling of the American Mind. And he spoke specifically to what you're talking about in that 10 years ago, 2013, 2014, iPhones being predominant within the freshman class, kind of how that took place, and the rearing of the children based on self-esteem and making sure that they didn't really have a lot to deal with as far as adversity. And then to your point, a lot of the things that are taking place on college campuses, you actually encompassed so much of what's taking place. And then to your earlier point, it's about in his book, I cite Dr. Haidt's book, is that they said in the 80s and 90s, there was a 4-to-1 ratio for liberal versus conservative.
Yeah.
And so you'd have one conservative professor for 4 liberals. Today in social sciences, which is obviously your subject matter expertise, it's 14-to-1. So you look at that and think, oh, okay. And this is, to your point, a lot of the conservative, especially my conservative friends, have been pointing this out for years. That college campuses, specifically today, the elite universities, are indoctrination centers for liberal orthodoxy. And so that's another piece that I thought was key. Another conservative thinker who I like, Andrew Sullivan, coined the phrase, said, we all live on campus now. Yeah. And, and because it used to be that the academy itself would have these ideas, critical race theory being one of them, right? Yeah. So back in the day, Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and all these big thinkers kind of had this idea around what took place with oppression and slavery and how the institutions themselves have been woven into the tapestry and how it's affected Black culture. And by the way, brilliant stuff. I mean, I loved it. I read the 1619 Project, and I've read a lot of Richard Delgado stuff. Early on, it was like intro to CRT because I didn't know enough to really understand the complexity of it. But what you talk about specific to that is that on college campuses now, we are seeing a lot of, and to your earlier, also your point is that 8 to 10% of the campuses are this very vocal, progressive group who are not happy, who do think that, the West in general, capitalism's a problem.
Sure.
White male patriarchy is a huge problem. Intersectionality, we need to raise police to the ground. It's like all of these there's not a lot of hey, let's work on a remedy. Let's work on an evolution of something. It's a revolution. Yeah. And I think that the joke with a lot of professors that I've interviewed is that, historically revolutions aren't good.
Yeah.
They don't play things with a lot of murder. So, I don't know if we actually want to go into revolution. And so, that's how do you see this on campus, specifically at Stetson, this 10% minority? And that's kind of where our body politic lies too, outside of the college world, is that you have, the 8% on the right that believe what took place on January 6th was a kumbaya on the steps. Yeah. And then on the left, you have the 8% that believes we need to abolish the police, and that every white person alive is a racist, per Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo. So, what do you see as a group, specifically in Florida? How is that manifesting, specifically critical race theory and gender ideology and all the big contentious topics that we have in our culture today?
Yeah, I think there's some good news in the sense that, in my interactions with students, so, it is certainly true that, our current generation of students are more liberal progressive than, older people are. Some of that's probably just age, and some of it might be generational, of course. But the reality is most of the students, at least that I come into contact with, and maybe there's some self-selection, that, some sample selection, but most of the students really do seem open to pushback. They really do want to learn. They're not going to turn into Reagan, fiscal conservatives or anything, but they're really open-minded. So, I talk about, slavery, and slavery was, endemic to all human societies. It wasn't like the West invented it or made it more brutal than it was before. Being a, Ottoman Empire galley slave was just as hideous as being, a slave in the Confederate South. And most students are, you can talk about indigenous culture and say that they were wonderful in some respects, but they kept slaves and they engaged in genocide. They colonized each other just like Europeans did. Basically, if you kind of put it in the perspective of universalism, that most students are actually pretty open to that, whether the students themselves are white or black or indigenous or Asian. They seem pretty, they want to learn, and I think what's happened with a lot of these young students, the typical student, that is through K through 12 and then into university, they just keep getting presented with a very singular worldview. And if everybody tells you that, European colonists were evil Nazis and they invaded this peaceful Pacific, idyllic Eden of indigenous cultures where everybody loved women and, and respected the environment. And, you know what I mean? If that's all they hear, then, they sort of assume that it must be true because they're kids. Why would, if every adult is, So I think a lot of the issue with modern education is this sense of whether it's K through 12 or if it's, at the university level, is just the kids just aren't hearing some other views, or data that would conflict with CRT or gender ideology or whatever these other things are, post-colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. I think once they do, they're like, oh, well, that makes sense, and they're not personally offended by it, So if you tell, for instance, a black student, well, slavery in the U.S. was terrible, absolutely, but Africans captured other Africans and sometimes kept them themselves and sometimes sold them to Europeans. And well, that's terrible too, right? It's just a human universal thing. And, and I think most students are okay with that. There does seem to be like I said, a subset of students who are not. And the problem, I think, for universities is we've kind of lost a sense of how, I think it's like you said, I don't think this is true just for universities, but I think as a culture, we sort of lost a sense of what to do with these people. Because, 15 years ago, you occasionally would see people melt down in meetings, right? And they would scream and cry and they would be vocally upset, but they didn't win, right? You could be empathic towards them and take them aside and say, obviously you're having a moment. Let's just, let's clean you up. We'll give you a hug. But they didn't win the debate, that if anything, if you just sort of lost your marbles, that counted against you in the debate. Now you win, right? I mean, the most angry person in the room wins the debate now. Whether they have facts or data, it doesn't really matter. All they need to say is, speaking as a blank, I am very traumatized by, and they won. And that's it.
Well, you touched on that in your piece called "The Mourner's Veto," right?
Yeah.
And by the way, great title. But that's actually, you're expanding upon that specifically, where the most sensitive and emotional person in the group wins the argument.
Yeah,
that's a really big problem. Is that something you see in the social sciences? Personally? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I think most students don't play it, but I mean, the problem is if you incentivize that kind of behavior, and this is basic psychology, right? If you incentivize a particular set of behaviors, then you're going to get more of it, right? And I think that's what's happening with some of like the gender identity stuff and so on and so. You're now seeing a lot of at least you're seeing at least some cases of white professors who are claiming to be indigenous, for instance, who are becoming, I suppose you could say, transracial or whatever the word is for that now. But I'm going to start saying, speaking as a short Irish, historically marginalized Irish, American, and to see if that gets me
that works.
Yeah,
that'll go over like a lead balloon. You mentioned in your piece that this became personal for you when your dissertation chair, Charles Nagy, was fired from the University of Central Florida for criticizing the Black Lives Matter narrative.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about that, because that, to your point, if you bring up and I've had friends get in trouble for this, for bringing up that exact piece specific to slavery.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to talk about global slavery,
right?
And compare it, because now you're not empathetic and you're a racist. So I mean, what took place with Charles, and why did it bug you so much?
Yeah, I mean, and just to speak to your point about the global slavery, I mean, of course, the irony is you see so many people today complaining about, like, how the U.S., is a slave-owning state, which it was, of course, is forever marked by this, on a device that is made with actual slave labor in the People's Republic of China today. I mean, so.
Well, there is that.
The lack of insight somewhat. I'm not saying we should all give up our iPhones or whatever, but, there should be a certain amount of moral humility at any rate. But yeah, so, Charles, who's a very blunt fellow, I don't think he would be insulted by my, saying that about him. He was my dissertation chair. We've remained friends, at this point for decades. And he doesn't pull punches and all that stuff. And he himself is Mexican American. He's gay. He's an atheist, so he's got a few, marginalized identities.
Got some points. Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, he doesn't really buy into this idea that, that the U.S. is a white supremacist, if anything, that I think part of his view is that people from historically disadvantaged minorities now get a fair amount of, like, through affirmative action, they get actually some privileges, and from my perspective, things are complicated and nuanced. In fairness, I think there's a long, complicated discussion about that stuff. But in June of 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, of course, the country lost its mind. Is really. And what happened to George Floyd was terrible. Of course, the police officers deserve to go to prison, but in terms of this being like a wider thing beyond that, all objective reason went out the window, essentially. And I had another scholar kind of described this to me at the time as being like a freight train, right? Like, you just can't step in front of the freight train, like it's a runaway freight train kind of thing. Right? But Charles stepped in front of the freight train, and so, like, in that moment when everybody, there's still people who've lost their minds, but like the people who lost their minds were the ones who got to speak, and everybody else, were wise, stayed quiet. Now, I won't lie, I stayed quiet too. I was terrified. So I have a family to feed as well, anyway, so he had gone on Twitter, which of course, hellhole anyway. But he went on Twitter and he said something to the effect of, well, in the U.S., Black people have some privilege, some forms of privilege. I don't remember his exact quote or whatever, which, I mean, I think I've actually seen essays come out since then that maybe less bluntly have made the same basic argument, that privilege is actually really complicated, at this point. But you only get like 280 characters, and he is by nature a bluntly spoken person anyway. He doesn't put sugar on the medicine. So in that moment when it really was like Salem, Massachusetts, essentially in the 17th century, that he became the witch, and had to be burned at the stake. So UCF, the University of Central Florida, which is the university he worked at, is where I got my dissertation. That's where I got my PhD. Basically all the students protested him. I think they had a protest outside his house. And again, it wasn't 100% of the students or even anything close to it. It might have been 1% of the students, but, they were the vocal ones, so they protested at the school outside his house. The president of the university made comments condemning, Charles. They launched an investigation. Now, of course, he's a public employee, so he has First Amendment protections. He can't be fired for that. So they launched a quote unquote, I put it in scare quotes, investigation. So they basically said, if any students in all of time, have ever had bad run-ins with Dr. Nagy, tell us now. Which is a classic witch hunt, right? Especially in this moment where, a lot of the accusations are going to be, I'm just going to say it, a lot of accusations are going to be false anyway, because but anyway, so these accusations were made, maybe some of them were true, maybe some of them were false, but whatever. But they were looking for something, that he had done or whatever. And, my impression is they didn't, come up with much, but, whatever they came up with was enough that they then fired him for some other thing, And so he was fired. I was terrified. It's like the French Revolution when you see like your mentor go up to the guillotine. You're like, oh, shit.
You're next.
I really was. I won't lie. I was, I wish I could say like, my backbone stayed with me the whole time. But I was I had family to feed. I was terrified. And I won't lie about it, but, so it ended up going to arbitration, so obviously he didn't take that line down, went to arbitration. And the short version is the arbiter, if that's the right word for it.
Yeah.
Basically said, the problem was that up until that moment, up until that tweet, they had been giving him raises and positive evaluation. Yeah. They've been singing his praises, and then all of a sudden they decided to fire him. It was obviously because of the tweet, no matter what other window dressing they put on it, but basically the arbiter said, like, even if he had done other things wrong, they needed to like give him feedback in that moment and give him a chance, of course, to change whatever the behavior was. And if these were things that happened like a decade earlier, then obviously they didn't do that. So basically it was a due process issue that, the arbiter decided that UCF had not engaged in proper due process. Basically he got his job back with tenure and full back pay. And my guess is he's still probably going to sue the state of Florida, for all this issue. But it was, I think, at the time, the president and other administrators at UCF they followed the scary crowd, right? There were Twitter mobs and all this other stuff. So they were trying to save their own necks in a way that was very cynical, I think. And now, almost 3 years later, I don't think UCF looks good for it. I mean, I don't, I don't think nobody's singing UCF's praises anymore, about this incident. I don't think defending them, and so I think that's an abject lesson for universities that sometimes it's fault, we've all read The Crucible, right? Nobody looks back and says, yeah, they were acting in good faith. I understand why they did, the whole point is to not do it, and so I think, even though we're still, somewhat in this moment, I think most people look back on UCF and think that they should have handled that situation far differently. They didn't necessarily have to do a full-throated defense of Charles, but firing him and sort of just joining the pitchforks and torches was the wrong thing to do for sure.
Yeah, we just reported on the Hamlin University saga in Minneapolis, and we wrote a piece on that. And for my listeners who didn't read that piece, it was a professor adjunct, so she didn't have tenure protection, and she wrote a syllabi that talked about specifically showing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad that was commissioned by a Muslim king. Mm-hmm. And in her syllabi, she said, if you're a member of the Sunni religion that believes you should not see photographs of the Prophet, just please understand we're talking about this on this day.
Yeah.
And she's liberal, and Hamilton's a very liberal university. And so she thought she did everything right. She checked all the boxes and, trigger warnings and making sure people understood the syllabus. And she was fired immediately. And, same thing. She was a very well-respected adjunct, and she's suing the university. So we'll see how that comes out. But it was one person.
Yeah.
And it was a young lady, Muslim, Black, very irritated, said that, it harmed her and the speech is violence and, a lot of that. And that's another thing that I've had a lot of discussions with, specifically to, other professors. There was a piece written by Mark Goldblatt. It was called The Approaching Disintegration of Academia. He's a professor at FIT in New York City. And same kind of thing happened, is that they were discussing and this is in your wheelhouse, a sociology course about LGBTQ that would really help the kids understand the complexity of this marginalized group of people, which now encompasses about 34% of our alphabet, but it's still a marginalized group. And he said, in the studies itself, there was a command, but it said something to the effect of, among the learning outcomes listed was a requirement that students develop a greater acceptance of LGBTQ perspective. And so he fought back on that. He's like, our job as professors is we need to keep in mind, and this is a quote, that we're a state university. Our mission is to pursue, ascertain, and disseminate objective truth, and to equip our students to do the same. Given that mission, I don't think we can list a learning outcome that requires students to assent on a matter of personal morality. And boy, he got hammered. And the reason I bring this up is because he is a tenured professor. While he was in the staff meeting, a colleague, fresh out of grad school, not yet tenured, was so visibly disturbed that she had a very difficult time even voicing her dissent. And she became apoplectic, to quote him, and so angry. She said, "I can't believe people still think this way," she sputtered. "Queer theory has deconstructed objectivity." Yeah. And everyone in the staff meeting just sat there because they're like, I don't know what to say. And, he was most dumbfounded by the fact that his colleagues in the sciences and the mathematician didn't say anything either. So it was like, wait, where are we going with this? Right. And, I share that story with you because it was one of those that stood out to me again, that this is becoming a religion. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. And you touched on that too in many of your articles. And you've written, just so I can share this with my audience, Stuck in the Middle was one. Stop sharing political memes. Great article. My APA resignation, which is the Association of American Psychological Association. We should talk about that. Are gamer stereotypes accurate? The futility of conservative war on pornography. Sex differences in cognition. Is gender a social construct? Motivated reasoning is disfiguring social sciences. I mean, you're just trying to get fired, dude. I mean, all these are huge topics. And in some of your stuff, you reference, pieces from John McWhorter as an example, who, as a Columbia professor, who was very vocal on specifically critical race theory. And he wrote a book called Woke Racism. Mm-hmm. And in it, he says that he's not comparing this level of, woke ideology, to use the overused phrase today, but he said it's not like a religion. It is a religion. And in this case, white privilege is the original sin. Mm-hmm. And then he references Robin DiAngelo and Imran Kendi and the folks that are out, very vocally leading the charge that all white people are racist. And that's a quote. Yeah. All white people are racist. That's the actual starting line. Like, that's where the actual, we need to have this session now. And every one of you in the room that is white, specifically us cis males, you guys are racist. And that's a brutal way to start any type of training, right? And I won't belabor that because I've done a lot of work on Robin DiAngelo and I disagree with her vehemently. But, what are your thoughts on this being a religion?
Yeah, I mean, I think and very. I mean, the only concern I would have is that it saying so might be insulting to a fair number of religions, but some of which are quite lovely, and
Yes,
so,
that's true. That's a good
not all
point.
religion is bad, but I think it specifically has this kind of like almost Calvinist, like hardcore Protestant Christian, like and again, they're lovely Protestant. I'm Episcopalian myself, so I'm not trying to slam all Protestants either, but it has this sense of like really fundamentalist, rigid, quasi-Christian, Judeo-Christian, Calvinism, that sense of like you're preordained, to sin or to if you're indigenous by virtue of being indigenous and you are morally upstanding. Same thing if you're black, but if you're white or Asian even perhaps, then you are sort of stained, by virtue of God already knows you're going to hell, kind of an essence to it. But yeah, there is this sort of original sin. There's the need for like public confession, the use of shame, the inability to really get back. It's just where I say it's more like Calvinist. There really is a sense of there's nothing you can do, right? There's really no forgiveness, in this model. I mean, other religions do at least have like forgiveness, and ways of redeeming yourself and whatever else. But this is, a very hardcore, version of it. So I think a lot of it is very faith-based, right? Because you can look at, some of these issues and people will say, and I just wrote on this in Newsweek, actually, that anti-Asian violence is white supremacy. I think you point out, but whites are actually underrepresented proportionally in perpetrators of Asian violence. It's actually Black people, but also other Asians, who are overrepresented in violence towards Asians. Not all Asians come from the same ethnic group, it turns out, right? And I think that's
topic.
and I think that's interesting data, right? I think that's interesting information. Now there are some white supremacists, right, who engage in anti-Asian violence, but it is the data is different from the narrative. So it's not just a sense of like, well, that is interesting, maybe, but I don't. I'm worried perhaps that your data is wrong would be a reasonable rebuttal, right? Saying like, well, maybe the data, there's something in there that is, biased or something of that sort. That's fair to be skeptical, but the sense of like, you're a racist for bringing it up, this like the data, not only can the data be wrong, but you're evil for having, supplied that data, and that's, I think, the element that looks again like this more fundamental Judeo-Christian sort of element that, it's not just, if you say like, it's happened to Galileo, right? It's not just that, you say that the Earth, in fact, revolves around the sun and you're wrong, but you're a heretic and must be punished. Right. You must be ostracized from society and prevented from having a platform. You must publicly apologize. And of course, the public apology won't actually redeem you. But
no, because it's never good enough. And that's, I think, the problem too for me on that piece with the Asian violence is that Asians, by the intersectionality code, are white adjacent.
Yeah.
They're not even considered a minority group anymore based on the success of the culture. And so I'm personally involved. My wife is Chinese, so my little boys by definition are half Chinese.
Right.
And I've lived with this culture now for 14 years. Yeah. My in-laws and my cousins and everyone else. And this is a very motivated culture specific to education. Right. And the same thing that talks, John McWhorter writes at length about, losing the race and winning the race, specifically around Black culture, what takes place with the, and he doesn't ever say that there's no such thing as racism.
Right.
He admits that. But when you get into these big, training DEI sessions that ask you, and there's a slide in Robin DiAngelo's training that says how to be less white.
Yeah.
And so, if you open up, I used to run ad agencies, and if I actually brought a leader like her into my leadership group and said, hey, we're going to go through some DEI training because it's good, because it is. Yeah. Here she is. And then, the floor is yours, Robin. And then, hey, so by the way, you're all racists. Yeah. And if you deny that you're a racist, it actually proves that you're a racist. And you're like, okay, so it doesn't matter what I say at this point. I'm hosed, right? I'm a racist. And so now, and that's where the religion comes to. And here's an example written by Mark Goldblatt. It says, it's a new secular faith, a version of the way. It's witness and testing. You gather for 3 hours a week to dwell in the spirit, commit yourself to individual rituals, which is true, collective causes, despair of the fallen state of humanity, call out and cast our demons, white privilege, immerse yourself in sacred texts, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, any of those things, then venture forth to spread the gospel, which again, a lot of my progressive friends are doing this online. I see it every day, being kind of a centrist politically and running a, political media company. I see all of this in both areas, right? It's like, and that's the same kind of thing where the Latinx thing for me, my mom's Mexican. And so I've always tried to figure out, like, what do you mean by Latinx? If you look at the data on it, I think it's 2% of the Hispanic population thinks it's cool. It's scary to me on that front, because you even pushing back on the Black Lives Matter. And again, all of these topics have, and you talk about this earlier in one of your articles, specific to our discourse has gotten so poisonous that we've lost the ability to have reasonable debate. And I'm paraphrasing you because I can't find it exactly. But, how do you see this moving forward as a professor and in psychology? I mean, you study human behavior for a living.
Yeah.
Are you you mentioned this already kind of in jest, but are you scared as a professor to talk about certain topics today that you would have talked about 10 years previous?
Yes, I think without question. I think most people are. I think, in fairness, things have gotten a little bit better over the last 2.5 years. I mean, so I think
that's good.
The apex of this was summer of 2020. And so I'll be very frank. That in my forensic psychology class, I have a module, if you will, that covers like race and policing and that sort of stuff. And it's all the nuances, it's all like, it's complicated, right? And really the gist of it is that, it's on both sides. It's probably more class than it is race, so, proportionally Black people are shot by police more often than white people are, though in terms of raw numbers, more white people are shot by police, but also proportionally more Black people commit crimes. So that's probably not a coincidence, right? That these track in the same direction. And by contrast, fewer Asians are shot by police, even proportionally, than either whites or Blacks, and same thing, for fewer Asians commit crimes than either whites or Blacks, so, and for some reason, Asians are always left out of that whole dialogue, which is fascinating, but, as usual, but so in that summer of 2020, I just no, we're not going to talk about it. I just took it out because it was just too toxic, and I since put it back in, and again the students are fine, and I sort of regret maybe I shouldn't have taken it out in the summer of 2020, but I had a family to feed, and I didn't want to step on the landmines, and I think part of what happened is I do have to give credit to people like John McWhorter and Coleman Hughes and Wilfred Riley and other mainly Black scholars, who
Roland Fryer,
exactly, who pushed back. They were the brave people, and they've gotten slings and arrows too. Angel Eduardo. And they get told that they're not really Black. That they're traitors. The N-word gets used on them by people who are ostensibly progressives, and so amazing. That happened with Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court. Did I get his name right? The justice. When he wrote, I guess. I think an assenting opinion on the Dobbs case, and like everybody's like, I'm not even but people, these are both Black and white people online are using the N-word and various versions of it, and it's like, oh, so we're not supposed to use the N-word unless it's Clarence Thomas, and then it's suddenly okay. I mean, that's very strange to me, but no, I mean, So I am tenured. I mean, that matters.
That helps, right?
That's help. But I think it was kind of like the putting the toe in the cold water phenomenon, like starting with a few things. Let's talk about it, and a few things here and there. And and our student body is, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's as close to nationally representative as a liberal arts university ever gets. So we have a fair proportion of Black and Latino students, a fair proportion of Asian students, as well as, of course, the majority are white, but, I think at about the level of the country. So maybe about 60%, that kind of number. And then, people just interested in, people also were just interested in information. So, I mean, I think my experiences have mostly been positive. I mean, I don't think I'm blunt in the same way that Charles Nagy is. That might be an element of it. So I do probably some degree of throat clearing, in the sense of like everybody should be respected. I'm an anarchist anyway, so I believe everybody should live their lives the way they wish. I have no interest in telling, gay people they can't marry, or that trans people can't get, if they're adults, or they can't get surgery that they wish. I don't live your life. You should get the best information that helps you make these decisions, but live your life how you want. And I really don't care, So I think, my students kind of know this, that I'm not like out to criticize their personal choices or even their worldviews, that stuff. My job is just to give them data, and that sort of stuff. And
teach objective truth, right? I think that's part of where, so you pulled stuff 2 years ago, as you said, the zenith of this was in 2020.
Yeah.
What made you feel okay to do that? Are you doing anything in the sense of trigger warnings?
Yeah.
Are you doing anything different as a professor to say, hey, in tomorrow's course, we're going to go over, genocide. We're going to go over, chattel slavery, and whatever it may be. What is that? What have you done differently on like the demonstrable pieces?
Yeah.
As far as like a syllabi or anything else?
Yeah, well, I mean, that moment, in 2020 is like I said, it's not one that I'm particularly proud of, that, I didn't go over that. So it definitely was a fear-based motivation.
Well, yeah, it's understandable.
So I'm not going to defend it other than saying, I was scared, I wouldn't be able to feed my family. That's It wasn't because I thought it was, good for the students in particular. I thought they should have this information, but, I just felt like, I just watched a colleague lose his job,
Right.
And there were news reports all over the country of similar things happening. And so just, as much as we would all love to think of ourselves as courageous people, even mine had limits. You know what I mean? And I had a kid and a wife I was responsible for. So, but it didn't last long. If I'm going to humble brag a little bit, So by that fall, I was back to teaching it and teaching everything else. And no, I don't know that I've really changed much. I mean, the one thing I do is, for most of my classes, unless it's like research methods that really doesn't hit anything terribly controversial, that I'll usually will send out an email to all my students before the semester starts and just say, look, here's what's going to happen. I'm just here to give you data. A lot of the data you're not going to like, whether you're like a Trump supporter or a Black Lives Matter supporter, something's going to come up. You're going to disagree with it. I'm totally cool with you disagreeing with it. We could even debate it as long as it's cordial. I'm up for that. But if it's going to like make you feel traumatized to hear me criticize either, former President Trump or Black Lives Matter, then maybe this just isn't, this isn't the class for you.
Okay. So you actually get into that level of detail and say, good. Because I mean, that to me is where most people of reason agree that college is a place to be offended.
Yeah.
Right. You're supposed to, that's part of it. You go there and mix with a whole bunch of different people, and they're obviously going to have their own opinions. And I understood historically, and Robert Jensen helped me with this a lot, the professor I just interviewed from University of Texas. He's a very kind man, and everything he said kind of emanated from that. And when I asked him about safe spaces, and I've heard this from other professors here in the Bay Area at Berkeley and University of San Francisco, is that they have a reason. So, marginalized groups like Black people and let's just say Muslim and or trans now, that they actually feel isolated and or scared sometimes on campuses. So they needed a place to go. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm cool with that. The problem that I had with safe spaces is they just kind of like anything liberal, it just continues to grow. And it got to the point where it was like, oh, we need a safe space for ideological and emotional harm.
Yeah.
So if there's someone who disagrees with me politically and he's wearing a red hat and he's preaching the GOP mantra, I'm now wounded. Like speech is violence. I need help. I need to be in a safe space. Brown University probably has the most egregious example of this, where they have milk and cookies and coloring books and beanbag chairs. And you're like, oh my God, are these 12-year-olds? I mean, it's like, this isn't for children. These are adults by definition. 18 to 22 is the most of the demographic. So, that to me is where I think that the academy itself, and I'm glad to hear from your perspective that it's pulling back, because it still has these moments where, I don't know if you read about this, but Gordon Klein is a professor at UCLA, and one of his teachers, right after the George Floyd stuff, wrote him a note and said, would it be possible for you to be less, to give less criteria for the Black students after the death for their homework, and on their assignments. And his response was, as follows. It was snarky, so I assume he was going to get it. But he said, thanks for your suggestion in email, but that I give Black students special treatment, given the tragedy in Minnesota. Do you know the names of the classmates that are Black? How can I identify them since we're having online classes? Are there any students that may be of mixed percentage, such as half Black, half Asian? What do you suggest I do with respect to them? Is it a full concession or just half? Okay. At this point, I read him like, dude, you knew you were doing with this. And then he continues to like twist the knife. Remember that MLK famously said that people should not be evaluated based on the color of their skin. Do you think your request would run afoul of MLK's admonition? Thanks, Gordon Klein. And, you can imagine the shitstorm that took place. There was 20,000 signatures within like 8 minutes for him to be removed. They did remove him. They suspended him. But then the story got, the national attention, counter petition signed, 76,000 signatures, put him back. And they reinstated him, but then they made him submit to DEI training and
struggle sessions.
I mean, it was brutal. And so like, that is why I asked you the question, like, how do professors, because Jonathan Haidt did the same thing. He teaches very differently than he did 10 years ago. He doesn't, he said he used to be very provocative on purpose.
Yeah.
And he would come in and say something like, okay, tell me what was good and bad on BLM. During the George, because there was good and there was bad, but he couldn't do that anymore, because if you actually point out that the BLM did some stupid shit, now you're a racist, even though they were burning down buildings, and you're like, well, no, that's we have to be able to draw a distinction there, right? And to your point, I'm hoping that within your own practice as a psychologist, and how other psychologists in the university tempering their teaching? Are they doing the same thing you're doing? Are they sending out stuff ahead of time and saying, this is what we're going to do, and if you have a problem with it, come and see me in the office, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I don't really temper my teaching anymore. I mean, I think I've gone back to being good. Pretty provocative. I think the most part. I think if you ask my students, they would say, I mean, we cover. Yeah, but I think it's a difference between I'm not snarky with the students though, so that's maybe where the third rail is or something. I think in general, if you communicate kindness towards the individual students, then they're more open, to you covering otherwise provocative things. So I mean, I think where the hesitance, is, I would, which is ironic because in a way, because you can find things about like, say like men, right? You can say, well, men commit 85% of violent crimes, and I'm not like offended as a man. That's just true.
It's just true. Right? Yeah.
So, but we somehow assume that like if it's a Black student, we say, well, like proportionally, Black Americans commit more crimes than their percentage of the population. Whatever. It doesn't mean everyone is Black or even the majority are committing crimes. So that's going to be traumatizing for them. But it isn't. I mean, I think for the most part, like, well, yeah, that's the data. I didn't commit any crimes, so it doesn't mean anything about me. Just right. Like saying that 85% of men, 85% of crimes are committed by men doesn't mean anything about me personally. So I think we assume our students are going to personalize stuff about identity in ways that they really don't. And again, I think as long as professors, we kind of like maybe throat clear a little bit in the sense of like, that's probably what I've changed, maybe a little throat clearing to saying like, look, you don't have to agree with me. And like, your views are fine. I actually welcome a cordial debate. Not that I wouldn't have done that before, but maybe I'm a bit more direct about saying that. But other than that, I mean, we talked about, like I just gave a test yesterday where one of the questions was, if you have ovaries, are, not in terms of gender identity, but in terms of biological sex, you are and the correct answer was,
okay. You did that. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's
because it's true. I mean, it's true. I mean, that is the definition of a biological female. Again, we can talk about gender identity and respect people who gender identity doesn't match their biological sex, but the reality is that sex is a binary, and if you have ovaries and you're biologically female, you might, you know, we can talk about, you know, the hypothalamus and gender identity and stuff like that. But so maybe a few people that doesn't match, but biologically speaking, you know, you're still likely to get, you know, ovarian cancer in a way that, you know, a biological male is not, no matter how you identify in terms of your gender. And we can be respectful of people, but also recognize that. So that's a lot of the message. Yeah, that I try to like thread that needle, saying that doesn't mean that we don't use people's pronouns or, you know, or let people live the way they want to live. If they want to get surgery to match their gender identity when they're an adult, I'm totally cool with that. You know, that's not my business. You know, like I said, I just don't take an interest in that sort of stuff. But you know, I got to tell you what a biological female is. You know, that's.
And have you had any pushback on that? Because there's a lot of professors that, I mean, obviously Jordan Peterson, which you wrote about, took, you know, he just refused to do the pronoun thing, and that's a whole other story. But specific to gender ideology, is, you know, I've done a lot of reporting on that, and I've been called a transphobe and a racist and a bigot because I would ask questions about the differences between sex and gender.
Yeah.
And so if you differentiate between those two, people say, well, you can't, you know, there's numerous sexes. And they're like, well, no, I'll give you numerous genders.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's like 75 that are approved in New York State as an example.
Mm-hmm.
But there's two sexes outside of abnormalities, right? There's small gametes, spermatozoa, and there's large gametes, which are, you know, eggs and ovum. And so you're like, that's it. As far as reproductive goes, there's two.
Right.
and you need those two to actually, you know, be close together for a short period of time, and they can procreate. And the issue then, specific to a lot of, you know, things you see on campuses, is that there are professors they get in trouble for saying what you just said. So it's good news that you're actually saying these things out loud to a diverse group of people on your campus, and specifically in your class, and there's been no serious ramification, because that to me was
maybe I'm walking the razor's edge more than I realize. Who knows? But I mean, and honestly, I mean, I've had students who are gay, students who are trans, you know, and again, I think a lot of it is, as long as you communicate respect for the individual students, you know. Now it would be different if you could have said, well, I'm not going to use, like you said, Peterson, like, I'm not going to use, I'm happy to use anybody's pronouns. That doesn't make that doesn't cost me anything, you know what I'm saying? And, you know, that's
I'm with you there. I'll say whatever makes someone else feel better. I mean, if someone's actually is dealing with that much emotional turmoil, the last thing I want to do is poke it, you know. Hey, I'll call you whatever you want, and I'll give you a hug, and, you know, good luck with that, because that can't be fun. But you mentioned in your article about Peterson, because we don't need to get into him as a character, but one of the things you talked about, and this is another question I had for other professors, is that the academy itself is where a lot of wonderful things trickle down. Right? Critical race theory being an example of that. And in general, you're seeing these young graduates, and this is also part of the thesis with Haidt and Greg Lukanioff's book, is that they're now moving into the private sector.
They are.
So you did a story about, or you wrote a piece about Penguin Random publishing Jordan Peterson's books. And the fact that people within the organization lost their mind, and they just did. The tears and the screaming, and this is violence to me, and I'm feeling physically assaulted. I feel unsafe. What do you think, as a psychologist, what is happening to our culture that way? And again, let's just, you know, reiterate that it's a small minority of people. Let's just say it's 8 to 10%, but that is something that is happening in corporate America, NGOs, nonprofits, academia, medicine, you know, because I've interviewed a lot of doctors about this specifically. What do you think, as a psychologist, what is happening?
Well, I think what's happening basically is we're giving that segment of the population a lot of power and authority is what's happening. And of course that then incentivizes more people to try to grift onto it, you know. I think there's probably a combination of people who, like, legitimately have a really strong emotional reaction to things that is not healthy, and we also have a group of grifters, you know, who are are pantomiming that for,
Sure.
for gain, and sometimes it's hard to tell who's who, right? Who are the grifters and who are legitimately, sometimes, the ones who are like obvious liars are probably more likely the grifters, but, but I think again, like what we started to do was when people would say like, knowing that Jordan Peterson exists somewhere in the world. And by the way, I'm not particularly a fan of Jordan Peterson. I have no real opinion on him one way or the other. But, that knowing that Jordan Peterson exists somewhere in the world is traumatizing to me, that we sort of move this direction of saying, well, what can we then do as a society to make you feel better? And I think what we need to do more of is saying, well, you need to get some help. Like, if like being unable.
That's exactly it.
To turn off the channel, to switch to another YouTube. You don't have to watch his YouTube videos. You don't have to read his books. That if it disturbs you to know that another human being somewhere on the planet is like, like right now, it's like, I don't know, this is going to be, so nerdy, but like Hogwarts Legacy. Like if someone on the planet is playing this video game, Hogwarts Legacy, and that like traumatizes you because you believe J.K. Rowling is a transphobe or something like that. It's not to like J.K. Rowling. You can still believe she's a transphobe, but if your day is over now because like this game got released, it's some of that's on you. I mean, it's not to say that you're a bad person, but you need to get help. And we as a society can't stop playing Hogwarts Legacy to make you feel better. Like only you can make you feel better. It's just not reasonable to think that the rest of us aren't going to play this video game. I didn't even want to play this video game until it became like a big deal. Now I feel like I have to go out and buy it because I've been told I can't, sort of a thing. Same thing, like, if other people read Jordan Peterson, who cares? It's not going to literally murder you as a trans individual, and I think that's kind of like people think, some of these problems are like a 3. Like, I get it. You don't want your group to be disparaged, and that's a fair concern. To think like this is literal genocide is dialing it up to like a 12, and this can be a 3, it's okay, to not like Jordan Peterson, write an op-ed, write your own book, you can criticize his work, and I'm open to, I think he sells a lot of woo, so I mean, I don't approve of a lot of the stuff he says. I'm open to the kind of argument, what I'm saying? But if your kind of argument is tearing your hair out, you're not really giving me much to work with here, so make a good database argument. If you can't, go get help or just turn off the damn television, or get off Twitter or whatever it is, but you can't expect everybody else to follow. It's just never going to happen. First off, we just can't. I would love it if everybody voted for my political candidate every 4 years or whatever, but they're not going to, and that's just the reality. And I have to accept that. If it makes me explode emotionally because I know somebody voted for Trump or something like that, then I need help. I mean,
that's a great point, because Greg Lukianoff actually talked about that in The Coddling of the American Mind, is that he actually suffered from chronic depression.
Yeah.
To the point where it was debilitating and he was non-functional. Yeah. And he went and saw, someone like yourself, and they used cognitive behavioral therapy and they deconstructed a lot of what was going on. And, I went through a lot of therapy myself, and I was fortunate enough to find a good clinical psychologist and go through a lot of the shit I needed to go through. And, she taught me a lot specific to, putting your head in the dragon's mouth. Yeah. Right? There's like, whatever you're fearful or whatever that hurts, I need you to go into it. And you need to dive into it, and then we'd dive into it and I'd be a mess. And then she'd pull me back out slow. And, he did the same thing. And I mentioned that as because of your pedigree, it's wonderful for you to hear this or for me to hear what you said, because to me, that's exactly what I was thinking, is if you're actually traumatized by words that you now think are violence, number one, you've never been punched in the face. Okay. There's for starters, words aren't the same. The word water doesn't make you wet.
Yeah.
Okay. So go get some help. Right. To your point, Jordan Peterson, his 12 Rules for Life, it seemed like a really good book. I read it years ago. And as a clinical psychologist, I was like, all right, that's pretty cool. Then he did some really shitty things and said some really shitty things. And so you're like, well, it doesn't mean he's just a bad human being that is should be deplatformed or non-platformed. He should never talk again because he traumatized you. It's like, to your point, shut off social media, go get some therapy, go for a run, pet your dog, talk to your friends, and just get over yourself. And that's a big piece of what I think scares me the most about this, even this fringe. It's, if you look at the analysis from Haidt and Lukianoff, the bigger problem, and Barry Wise talks about this at length, is that these are the best and brightest universities we have to offer. So the top percentage of our academia are going into all the aforementioned fields. And they're all being taken over by an ideology. Medicine is even being taken over. I interviewed numerous clinicians specific to gender ideology, and there's now an asterisk next to people's names based on male and female, because when they come in, they identify as their actual gender descriptor.
Right.
But to your point about the hypothalamus and other major characteristics within the physiology between males and females, it's not okay as a clinician to actually give medication to what you think is a man or a woman biologically, because it will harm them.
Right, exactly.
And so it's in the medical field, it's in the psychology field, it's in corporate America for sure, specific to DEI. And now you're seeing it just run the gamut. And that's to me where we can't treat this 10%, 8%, whatever that number is gelled at, with these kid gloves, because it just empowers them. And to your point, it brings in others. Like, oh, I want to get special treatment. I'm going to cry when someone says something that affects me negatively. That to me seems like a really slippery slope as a culture.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think you see that with some of the gender stuff. Like I said, I mean, there are real, what used to be called transsexuals, and, their situation is tragic, and I believe that there are some individuals. I know some people describe themselves as non-binary, and they live very non-binary lives. I mean, I believe it.
I do too. I don't have a problem with that.
But then I think you do see people that are like, I mean, the one I always like is like the demisexual, right? That's like, I only have sex with people I'm in love with, sort of thing. And it's like, I mean, that's kind of like
that used to be called love.
I mean, that's I have to have an emotional attachment to someone before I'm attracted to. I think there's one like the gender changes when different music is on or something like that. So there's always like a
and see, that's where you're just taking it one step too far. Like the average person's like, oh, okay. So if Pink Floyd's playing, then you're more masculine. Oh, by the way, we got to talk, because you mentioned in your bio that you do really bad covers of Pink Floyd in your band. And so, on the right, which is another example of just complete craziness, is when they released their 50-year anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon. You saw this, right?
That one, yeah.
How dare you go woke? Because what's with the rainbow? And you're like, oh my God. And this is just a capture of how stupid some of our culture is, because these are people that are protesting against Pink Floyd, and they obviously never listened to the album.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, it was 50 years ago, you knucklehead. And were they woke 50 years ago? Just go on Google and look up Dark Side of the Moon. There's a capture of the cover. We've just gone nuts. Just gone nuts.
Well, I think that's exactly it. I think news media plays a role in this. The social media plays a role in this to some extent too.
Oh, no question.
It's just we've really given incredible power to people with the most extreme views, and as you say, this is true on the right, with the QAnon, sure. Stop the Steal, all this stuff. I don't have to live on the right. I have to live on the left, so I probably criticize the left more than the right for that reason. But it absolutely is true that the Trumpism or whatever the hell we want to call that stuff is just as crazy and wacky and destructive.
For sure. Yeah, no, it's more brazen. I think the idea of like our brethrens, it's more insidious. It's like, it's kind of like bubbling below the surface, as opposed to like someone like Donald Trump is just beating you over the head with his ideology and his nonsense. But I think to close out, you mentioned Batya Ungar-Sargon in one of your books, and you write for Newsweek. She wrote a book, and we can end on the media, because you did mention the media is part and parcel to this problem. What are your thoughts on the media and the psychology side of it? Because, did you read her book, Bad News, by the way?
Yeah. I read about a year ago. For a year ago, somewhere in there. Yeah. Really good book. And, from someone like myself, I spent 20 years in the media business, and I sold media to the New York Times, and she surfaced a memo in 2014
that was given out to the reporters. And it was like, we need you to build your social graph. We want you to make sure you build as many followers as you can online. And, and I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect is just remember that 91% of our subscribers are Democrats. And, if you lose your following, you kind of lose your grit. And that really goes against, the historical norms of good old shoe leather reporting. Yeah. It was a trade. It was like, hey, truth to power. Let's push back on the nonsense. And, what are your thoughts on that as a psychologist and someone who looks at the world through that lens? What do you think's happening in the media? Because I think the left in general, obviously both parties have their own, blowhorn, right? Fox on the right and MSNBC on the left. And I don't really necessarily compare the two, but Fox News, I should say, like Brett Baer and Chris Wallace and those kind of cats that, there is that. But what do you think about the media from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, and thinking again of like Jonathan Haidt, I think probably the place that he and I would disagree is the relative importance of news media and social media, where, I think social media plays a role in political polarization, but I actually think news media probably is a bigger driver than social media is for a lot of the stuff. So, one of the studies I did is actually looking at, and I believe it was looking at the New York Times, was looking at news media coverage of, police shootings of black men, unarmed black men, versus the actual incidents of police shootings of black men. And one of the things that, became apparent in looking at this data is that race relations, which have plummeted over the last decade, by the way, in 2014, race relations were not perfect by any means, but pretty good, actually. Both black and white people thought things were moving in the right direction. And now we've seen this massive plummet, in those numbers. And a lot of that seems to be, or at least some of that seems to be, it's a complicated issue, of course, but some of that seems to be driven very specifically by news media reporting, so if you look at like the correlation between actual shootings of black men, those have gone down over time. They're actually pretty rare. It's like, unarmed black men is, maybe I think in 2020 it was 4. Over the course of a year, in most years it's probably close to like 10 or maybe.
Yeah, it was 18 in 2020.
Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah, it's a relatively rare event. So the correlation between actual incidences and public race relations, it wasn't any, but on the other hand, what happened is during that time period, news media really started picking up on these stories and highlighted them. So what you have is when, a young black man is shot by police, that gets national news attention. When a young white man who's unarmed is shot by police, just nobody cares. This just doesn't get any coverage at all, And so I think that stuff like that is, and like you said, it's catering to the audience, right? It's catering to the narrative, if you will. And I think, it's bad. It's not the only thing, right, by any means, that's contributing to our problems, but I think it is something that is contributing, to our problems. I think the New York Times is almost like the temperature, of the left, right, at this moment, right?
For sure.
So like you said, it's like not 95% the readership is on the left, so I think the encouraging thing about the New York Times is they're still full of crap a lot, but that they did hire John McWhorter, right? They did. Yeah. We have seen some articles in the New York Times pushing back against the gender ideology and that sort of stuff. Now we also see rubbish, but at least that ratio of rubbish to at least a different viewpoint is better than it was again 2.5 years ago. I think still there's plenty of rubbish, but at least they're allowing some stuff in. So I think that's a sign of optimism. And I've seen a few articles of people coming out and kind of saying that like wokeism or whatever the hell we're calling this thing is it reached its peak and now is beginning to slowly recede. I hope they're right. I see some signs of that. And like I said, I think, my experience in working at the university are definitely things are better today than they were 2.5 years ago, at least at my university. And granted, I think Stetson always kind of tried to thread the needle better than Hamlin or, Oberlin or, Brown.
Or Evergreen.
Evergreen.
Yeah, no.
Some of his other places.
That's encouraging to hear, Chris, because, we can just close out on that note because I always like to close out on a positive. I think that professors like yourself and Jonathan Haidt and Glenn Lurie and John McWhorter, and then editors like Batya Ungar-Sargon, It is happening. I've seen it happening. I think the fact that you're seeing a demonstrable difference, not only with your students, but the way you're teaching, you're not as scared as you were 2 years ago. Yeah. You obviously can put out the trigger warnings and part of your syllabi and say, hey, this is what we're going to talk about, but I'm not going to shy away from this. Yeah. That's really good news, because I think that, like anything, the pendulum swings in culture. Yeah. And I think that a lot of it, and I always try to put a compassionate lens on my progressive friends, is that they genuinely want to help. And they want everyone to feel safe and never be offended. And, that's utopian. And I think it comes from a good place, but it's just not going to happen. So it's like, we need to kind of train people to be adults. And I think that's what college in part is for, is that 4 years of being offended and being put out and staying up all night doing your homework and, building friends and networks and things like that. I think that's really what's important. So thank you again, sir, for your time. And I really enjoyed all of your articles. And I look back, maybe, depending if we have, we're starting to do True 30 debates. So maybe if you're willing to do that, I'll bring you in as a panelist and we can talk about some of these subjects. So thanks again for your time, and enjoy your upcoming weekend.
Awesome. You too. Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Cheers.